He rose from a divided land where silence meant survival. From a Catholic boy in a Protestant town to the world's most unlikely action legend. Liam Neeson's story is not about fame. It's about grief, endurance, and the love that no role, no script, and no amount of time could ever replace. William John Neeson was born on June 7, 1952, in Ballymena, a small industrial town in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. Not a romantic countryside village, not a city buzzing with opportunity. Ballymena was a place of hard men, hard winters, and harder silences. A Protestant-majority town where a Catholic family like the Neesons existed on the margins of an invisible but unmistakable divide. His father, Bernard Neeson, was a caretaker at a local school, a quiet, steady man who measured the world in honest labor and kept his emotions locked behind a door he rarely opened. His mother, Kitty, was a school cook, warm, grounded, and deeply Catholic. The kind of woman whose faith was not performed on Sundays, but lived in the fabric of every ordinary day. Together, they raised 4 children in a modest, terraced house where money was always tight, and expectations were simple. Work hard, stay humble, cause no trouble. For young Liam, trouble found him anyway, not from rebellion, but from geography. Growing up Catholic in Ballymena in the 1950s and 1960s meant growing up on the wrong side of an invisible line. The Troubles, the decades-long conflict between nationalist and unionist communities, had not yet erupted into full-scale violence. But the tension was already sown into the streets. Catholic boys walked certain routes, avoided certain corners, learned early that belonging was conditional, and that safety required awareness. He was tall from a young age, awkwardly, conspicuously tall. By his early teens, he stood well over 6 feet, all sharp angles and restless energy. A boy whose body seemed to have arrived before he knew what to do with it. That size made him a target sometimes, but it also pointed him toward the one place where being large and physical made sense. The boxing ring. At 9 years old, Liam Neeson walked into the Emerald Amateur Boxing Club and discovered something he hadn't expected. Discipline. Not the punishment kind his Catholic school teachers dispensed with rulers and righteous authority, but the internal kind. The kind that came from learning that control of your body and control of your fear were the same skill. He trained seriously, fighting as an amateur until his late teens, accumulating a record that earned him regional recognition. The ring gave him structure when the streets offered only tension, and confidence when the world seemed designed to remind him of his limitations. School was another story. St. Patrick's Boys' School and later Ballymena Boys' Secondary Intermediate School were not environments that celebrated the kind of intelligence Liam carried. Intuitive, restless, more drawn to story than to formula. He was not a poor student, but he was not an obvious one either. Teachers moved past him. Systems categorized him. And the particular cruelty of an educational framework that measures worth by examination results left him feeling not unintelligent, but unseen. Then came the moment that changed everything, and it arrived not in a theater or on a screen, but in a school hall, in the form of a drama teacher named Mr. Clement McCloskey. Miss McCloskey ran the school's amateur dramatic society and needed bodies to fill a production. Liam, at 11 years old, was handed a role more out of necessity than belief. But, from the moment he stepped onto that makeshift stage, something shifted. The boy who had learned to contain himself in the boxing ring discovered that the stage demanded the opposite. Expansion, presence, the willingness to let something private become publicly visible. He was not merely reciting lines, he was inhabiting someone else's skin. And for a boy who had spent his childhood navigating invisible borders, the freedom of becoming someone else entirely was not escape. It was revelation. He kept acting through his teenage years, quietly and without grand ambition. Drama was not a career plan. It was a pulse, something he returned to the way some people return to music or prayer, not because it promised anything, but because it felt true. At 17, Liam left school and took a job as a forklift operator at the Guinness Brewery in Belfast. It was honest work, the kind his father would have recognized and respected. He drove the machine through long shifts, ate lunch with men twice his age, and went home to a town still humming with sectarian unease. The troubles were deepening. Bombings, shootings, roadblocks. The rhythm of violence had become mundane background noise in Northern Ireland by the early 1970s. He tried teaching next, enrolling at St. Mary's College in Belfast to train as a primary school teacher. He lasted 2 years before the pull of something else, undefined, urgent, impossible to name, drew him away. He applied to the Lyric Theatre in Belfast and was accepted. Not to perform immediately, but to learn, to watch, to sit in rehearsals, and absorb the mechanics of how a story could be made to breathe. The Lyric gave him his first real professional footing. And Belfast, despite its violence and division, gave him something equally important: the understanding that human suffering was not abstract. It was specific. It had addresses, accents, and faces. It was his neighbors and his streets and his silence at checkpoints. That specificity, the refusal to generalize pain, would become the defining quality of every performance he would ever give. He was not yet an actor, not in the world's eyes. He was a tall boy from a divided town, holding a quiet fire that had no outlet yet, and no guarantee of one. But it was burning. The Lyric Theatre in Belfast was not Broadway. It was not even close. A modest repertory company operating in a city where explosions occasionally interrupted rehearsals, and actors learned to continue their lines through the distant percussion of a world coming apart outside the walls. But for Liam Neeson, it was everything. It was the first place that took his instinct seriously and handed it a structure. He joined the Lyric in 1976, at 23, already older than most young actors arriving at their first professional stage. The delay was not laziness. It was the geography of his life. A working-class Catholic boy in Northern Ireland did not dream of acting academically. He arrived at it the way most people arrive at their truest calling: sideways, through detours, through jobs that paid and passions that didn't. At the Lyric, he worked under the direction of established figures who recognized immediately that something in Neeson operated differently. He was not a showy performer. He did not chase the audience's eye with tricks or movement. Instead, he went still. And in that stillness, something enormous happened. The audience leaned toward him. Directors noticed that the camera, even in those early stage productions, found Neeson's face and stayed there, as though it sensed something unresolved and needed to wait for its answer. He spent 2 years at the Lyric, building the technical foundation that his raw instinct had always lacked: breath control, physical presence, the architecture of silence. How a body occupies space on a stage is as much a language as words, and Neeson learned to speak it fluently. So not with the elegance of classical training, but with the blunt, grounded physicality of a man who had once stood in a boxing ring and understood that stillness before a strike is its own form of power. In 1978, he made the move that every serious Irish actor of his generation eventually made: Dublin, the Abbey Theatre, Ireland's national theatre, was the institution that separated ambition from commitment. To be accepted, there was not merely a career step, it was a declaration. The Abbey had shaped some of the most significant voices in 20th century drama, and its stages carried the weight of a cultural identity that the Irish had fought, bled, and written to preserve. Neeson arrived at the Abbey with the discipline of 2 years of professional work behind him, and the hunger of a man who understood, but now, without any ambiguity, that this was the only life he wanted. He performed in productions that ranged from Sean O'Casey to Chekhov, absorbing the full range of the repertoire while developing the one quality that would eventually make him irreplaceable on both stage and screen: emotional authenticity without sentimentality. He did not cry on cue. He didn't manufacture feeling. What he did, what very few actors can do, was locate the specific truth inside a scene and present it without ornament. Grief looked like grief. Love looked like something frightened of itself. Anger arrived not as explosion, but as controlled pressure, the way a fist tightens before it opens. It was at the Abbey that director John Boorman first saw him. Boorman was casting his 1981 Arthurian epic, Excalibur, and needed actors who could carry mythological weight without disappearing into costume. He cast Neeson as Sir Gawain, a secondary role, but a visible one. And when Excalibur was released, something happened that Neeson had not planned for and was not yet equipped to manage. Hollywood noticed. The calls came slowly at first. Small inquiries. Meetings arranged through agents who were not yet fully committed to a career that existed mostly on Irish stages. Neeson flew to London, then to Los Angeles, then back to London, orbiting an industry that was interested but not yet convinced. He appeared in Krull in 1983, another fantasy epic that did little for anyone involved. Then The Bounty in 1984, alongside Mel Gibson and Anthony Hopkins, where he was credible but peripheral. And then a string of supporting roles in films that came and went without leaving marks. The frustration was real. He was not failing. He was working consistently in legitimate productions alongside established names. But there is a particular purgatory that talented actors inhabit for years. The space between being respected and being seen. Directors trusted him. Audiences didn't yet know his name. He was the man other actors pointed to in the rushes and said quietly, "Watch him." But nobody was yet saying it loudly enough. In 1987, he returned to the stage for a Broadway production of Anna Christie, opposite Natasha Richardson. It was a professional engagement, nothing more, on paper at least. But the stage has a way of collapsing the distance between people. And something between Neeson and Richardson, electric, uncomplicated, and entirely unplanned, began quietly in the wings. He would not know it yet. But that production was not merely a role. It was the beginning of the most important story of his life. By the late 1980s, Liam Neeson had built something rare and quietly impressive. A career of consistent, respected work that somehow remained invisible to the wider world. He had appeared in nearly a dozen films, performed on Broadway, earned the admiration of directors who competed to work with him, and still managed to walk through airports without being recognized. He was, in the industry's cruel taxonomy, a working actor. Talented, reliable, forgettable to the public. Then came Steven Spielberg. In the early 1990s, Spielberg was preparing what would become the most morally urgent film of his career. An adaptation of Thomas Keneally's novel Schindler's Ark, the true story of Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist and member of the Nazi Party who saved the lives of more than 1,000 Jewish workers during the Holocaust by employing them in his factories. It was not a comfortable story. It was not designed to be. And the man at its center, charming, contradictory, morally ambiguous, capable of both profound selfishness and extraordinary courage, was one of the most complex figures ever committed to screen. Spielberg's search for his Schindler was exhaustive and, at times, desperate. He considered Kevin Costner, who was at the height of his post-Dances with Wolves power. He looked at Mel Gibson. He tested Warren Beatty. Each brought obvious commercial logic. Each, ultimately, was wrong. Not in talent, but in texture. Schindler required something those men couldn't offer, and the quality of a man who contains multitudes without announcing them. A man whose goodness arrives not as declaration, but as action, reluctant and almost accidental. It was Neeson's stage work that led Spielberg to him, specifically a performance in Anna Christie, the same Broadway production where he had first met Natasha Richardson. Spielberg saw in Neeson not a star, but a force of nature operating at low frequency, the kind of actor who made the space around him credible. He arranged a meeting, then a screen test. Then, after deliberation that kept Neeson's future suspended in uncertainty for weeks, the call came. He had the role. Schindler's List began filming in Poland in March 1993. Spielberg chose to shoot in black and white, on location in Krakow, and at the site of the actual Płaszów concentration camp. A decision that stripped the film of any aesthetic distance and placed its actors inside a reality that was not symbolic, but viscerally present. For Neeson, the weight of this was immediate and total. He later described the experience as the most psychologically demanding of his professional life, not because of the physical conditions, though those were grueling, but because Oskar Schindler required him to hold contradictions simultaneously. Vanity and compassion, opportunism and sacrifice, moral blindness evolving into moral clarity, without ever allowing the audience to settle into a simple verdict about the man. Every scene demanded precision. Every silence carried consequence. The iconic final sequence, Schindler standing before the workers he has saved, suddenly broken by the realization that he could have saved more, and that his Nazi pin alone could have bought another life, that his car represented 10 more souls, was filmed over multiple days. Neeson later admitted he could not find the scene intellectually. He had to locate it somewhere beneath thought, in the part of a person that responds to guilt not as concept, but as weight. When the tears came, they came from somewhere real. And everyone on set knew it. Schindler's List was released in December 1993. Its reception was not merely enthusiastic, it was seismic. Critics spoke in terms usually reserved for literature rather than cinema. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Spielberg. And Neeson, nominated for Best Actor, found himself standing at the center of a cultural moment that rewrote his entire professional existence in a single evening. Overnight, The Invisible Man became undeniable. The nominations and awards that followed were significant. A BAFTA nomination, a Golden Globe nomination, the Screen Actors Guild recognition. But more consequential than the trophies was what Schindler's List did to the perception of what Liam Neeson was. He was no longer the dependable supporting presence in someone else's film. He was, demonstrably and irrefutably, one of the finest actors of his generation. Directors who had hesitated now called without hesitation. Studios that had filed him under reliable but not marquee revised their files entirely. He followed Schindler's List with Rob Roy in 1995, playing the Scottish folk hero with the same physical authority and moral gravity that had defined his Schindler. Then Michael Collins in 1996. Neil Jordan's sweeping portrait of the Irish revolutionary leader, a role that felt almost fated. A Catholic boy from Northern Ireland, playing the architect of Irish independence, bringing to the screen a man whose complexity mirrored his own formation. Both films confirmed that Schindler's List was not accident, but arrival. The world had finally caught up with what Belfast and Dublin and the Lyric Theatre had known for years. Yet even in this extraordinary ascent, something private was deepening. The woman he had met on the stage of Anna Christie a decade earlier, Natasha Richardson, daughter of the legendary actress Vanessa Redgrave, an actress of remarkable intelligence and warmth in her own right, had remained in his orbit through the years of struggle and uncertainty. Their connection had survived the distance of separate careers, separate continents, and the slow burn of a love that neither had rushed, because neither entirely trusted how significant it already was. In 1994, the year after Schindler's List transformed his career, Liam Neeson and Natasha Richardson were married. He had reached the summit of his profession. He had found the love of his life. For a man who had grown up on the margins of everything, it must have felt, however briefly, like a rival. Natasha Richardson was not a trophy. She was not an accessory to Liam Neeson's ascent, nor a footnote in the biography of a famous man. She was, by every account of everyone who knew them, the architecture of his life, the thing that made the rest of it make sense. She came from theater royalty, daughter of Vanessa Redgrave, one of the most celebrated actresses of the 20th century, and director Tony Richardson. She had grown up inside the industry the way some children grow up inside churches, surrounded by its rituals, fluent in its language, shaped by its demands before she was old enough to choose them. Yet she wore none of it as weight. Those who knew her described a woman of extraordinary warmth, sharp wit, and an almost deliberate ordinariness. Someone who could discuss Shakespeare at dinner and then dissolve into helpless laughter over something completely absurd without any sense of contradiction. For Liam, she was the first person who saw him clearly without needing him to perform clarity. The man who had spent his childhood invisible, his early career overlooked, and his professional years quietly grinding toward a recognition that never felt guaranteed. That man, in Natasha's presence, simply existed, without armor, without the careful management of impression that public life demands. She did not love the actor. She loved whatever was underneath the actor, the boy from Ballymena, who still lived somewhere beneath the suits and the film premieres and the critical acclaim. Their marriage in 1994 was private, deliberate, and entirely unglamorous by Hollywood standards, which is to say, it was exactly right for both of them. They settled into a life that prioritized normalcy with the intensity of people who understood how abnormal their world actually was. They had two sons, Michial, born in 1995, and Daniel, born in 1996. The family divided their time between New York and a home in Ireland, constructing a domestic life that was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Neeson's career through the late 1990s and into the 2000s continued its upward trajectory. Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace in 1999, where he played Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn with the same gravity he brought to everything. Batman Begins in 2005. Kinsey, Kingdom of Heaven. But those who worked closely with him during those years noted something that his public image rarely conveyed. He was a man who left the set at the end of every day for a reason. The work was important. The family was sacred. Natasha continued her own remarkable career. A Tony Award for her Broadway revival of Cabaret in 1998. film work of consistent intelligence, a presence in the theatrical world that existed entirely on its own terms, not as an extension of her husband's fame, but as its own luminous thing. They were, in the industry's vernacular, a power couple. But that framing always missed the point. They were, more simply and more profoundly, a family. Then came March 18, 2009. Natasha Richardson arrived at the Mont Tremblant ski resort in Quebec, Canada, for a beginner ski lesson. She was not an experienced skier. The slope was gentle, the conditions unremarkable, the lesson routine. At some point during the session, she fell. It appeared minor. She stood up, seemed composed, declined medical attention twice when resort staff offered it. She returned to her hotel room and called friends, laughing about the fall, apparently untroubled. 2 hours later, she complained of a severe headache. An ambulance was called. By the time she reached the hospital, it was already too late to reverse what had happened inside her skull. The fall had caused a traumatic epidural hematoma, bleeding between the skull and the brain. And the 2 hours between the fall and the onset of visible symptoms had consumed the window in which intervention might have changed everything. She was transferred first to a hospital in Montreal, and then airlifted to Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, where Neeson and their sons could be with her. Liam flew through the night. When he arrived, the doctors told him what the scans already showed. Natasha had suffered catastrophic brain damage. She would not recover. He made the decision no human being should ever have to make. On March 18, 2009, 2 days after the fall, Natasha Richardson was taken off life support. She was 45 years old. What followed for Liam Neeson is almost impossible to articulate. Not because the grief is unfamiliar in its nature, but because its scale was total. He had lost not just his wife, but the person around whom his entire private self had been organized for 15 years. The man who had grown up starved of belonging, who had found in Natasha something he had never been guaranteed and had never taken for granted, was now required to continue existing inside a life whose most essential element was simply gone. Friends described him in those early weeks as hollowed, present physically, absent in every way that mattered. He moved through the world performing the functions of a father, getting the boys to school, maintaining routines, providing the illusion of stability for two young men who were themselves shattered, while carrying inside him a grief so heavy it altered his posture. He later spoke about it publicly, with an honesty that made audiences go silent. He described the experience of grief as physical, a literal weight, a pressure in the chest that never fully lifted. When he talked about seeing a woman in a parking lot wearing a similar coat to Natasha's and being unable to breathe, about the ambushes of ordinary objects, a coffee cup, a book left open, a song playing in a restaurant that arrived without warning and reduced him without mercy. He kept working, not because work was comfort, but because stillness was unbearable, and his sons needed to see their father standing. He threw himself into filming with a ferocity that those on set recognized, not as professionalism, but as survival. The camera became the only place where the grief had somewhere to go, where the weight of a man carrying the uncarryable could be transformed briefly into something that looked like purpose. He would never fully recover. He has said so himself, clearly and without self-pity. And you don't recover from the loss of someone like that. You learn, slowly and imperfectly, to carry it differently. But in those first years, the carrying nearly broke him. In 2008, 1 year before Natasha died, a film was released that nobody expected to matter. Taken was not a prestige production. It carried no award ambitions, no critical pedigree, no cultural weight beyond the simple promise of a father rescuing his kidnapped daughter from traffickers in Paris. It was efficient, propulsive, and built almost entirely on a single scene, a phone call between a desperate father and the men who had just taken his child. That scene produced one of the most quoted monologues in modern cinema. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I have acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you." Liam Neeson delivered those lines at 55 years old, an age at which most actors of his caliber were transitioning toward elder statesman roles. Wise mentors, aging patriarchs, distinguished supporting presences in younger people's stories. Instead, Taken turned him into something the industry had never quite seen before. An action star forged not from youth and physical spectacle, but from gravity, from voice, from the specific and terrifying credibility of a man who had already lived through enough to make the threat absolutely believable. The film grossed nearly $225 million worldwide, against a budget of $25 million. Studios recalibrated their understanding of what Neeson could carry. And Neeson, still processing the early tremors of a grief that would consume him entirely the following year, found himself standing at the entrance of an entirely new chapter of his career. One that felt, in its own strange way, like a gift he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he deserved. After Natasha's death in March 2009, the action films kept coming. The A-Team, Unknown, The Gray, Non-Stop, A Walk Among the Tombstones, Run All Night. Each one placed him in the role of a man fighting against impossible odds, to protect someone he loved or to survive forces larger than himself. Critics occasionally sniffed at the repetition. Audiences kept arriving. What those critics missed, and what audiences understood instinctively, even without the language to articulate it, was that Neeson's grief was not hidden behind those performances. It was inside them. The particular quality that made his action work so unexpectedly compelling was not choreography or physicality, though both were credible. It was the weight. The sense that behind every punch thrown and every threat delivered was a man who had already survived something that made physical danger look almost manageable by comparison. The Gray, released in 2012, came closest to making this subtext explicit. In it, Neeson played an oil pipeline worker stranded in the Alaskan wilderness after a plane crash, hunted by wolves, forced to watch his companions die one by one, while confronting his own desire to simply stop fighting. The film opened with a voiceover letter to his absent wife. Tender, broken, searching. A letter that many viewers recognized as something far more personal than fiction. Neeson has never fully confirmed how much of himself he placed in that film. He has never needed to. The performance speaks its own truth. Through those years, he was also navigating grief in public, in ways that required a courage different from anything the films demanded. In a 2014 interview, he described the physical reality of loss with a bluntness that stopped audiences mid-breath. In 2017, he told an interviewer that he still had moments, years later, where the grief ambushed him without warning. In airports, in hotel rooms, in the ordinary silences between takes. He did not perform these admissions. He stated them the way a man states facts about weather. This is the climate I live in. This is what it is. His sons, Mishael and Daniel, became the organizing principle of his survival. And he has spoken consistently about the responsibility of fatherhood as the thing that made retreat impossible. The boys needed to see their father present, functional, and continuing. Not because grief was wrong, but because life required continuation regardless of whether it felt possible. He moved them between New York and Ireland, maintained the rhythms of school and normality, and gave them, by every account, the stability that his own public grief might have threatened had he been a less deliberate parent. Michael, who uses the stage name Michael Richardson in honor of his mother's family name, became an actor. Neeson has spoken of watching his son perform with an emotion that mixes pride with something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps, that in Michael's face and voice and instinct. Natasha continues. Daniel pursued a quieter path, away from the industry, which Neeson has supported with equal conviction. Both boys, he has said, are his most important achievement, not Schindler's List, not Taken, not the decades of critical recognition. The boys. By the mid-2010s, Neeson had also become one of the most significant voices speaking publicly about the human cost of violence, in ways that extended beyond the screen. Following Natasha's death, he became an advocate for ski helmet awareness, working with trauma specialists and resort safety organizations to push for better protocols at ski facilities. The 2-hour delay between Natasha's fall and her emergency treatment representing a gap that better awareness might have closed. He did not turn grief into a campaign. He turned it into action. Quiet, specific. He aimed at preventing the same silence from falling on another family. In 2015, a controversy erupted that tested his public standing in ways even the tabloids hadn't managed. In an interview promoting a film, Neeson described an incident from decades earlier, a period following the assault of a close friend, during which he had walked the streets in a state of rage so consuming that he had looked for a confrontation with a stranger to unleash it upon. He described the episode with the same unflinching honesty he brought to everything, framing it as a confession of shame, an example of how grief and rage can corrupt a person's thinking into something monstrous. The admission was meant as a meditation on the cycle of violence. It was received, by many, as something far more damaging. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Headlines stripped the confession of its context and presented it as evidence of something uglier. Premieres were reconsidered. Campaigns were questioned. And Neeson, who had offered the admission voluntarily and without calculation, found himself standing in the center of a storm that no amount of clarification could fully calm. He did not retreat. He did not issue the standard formula of publicist-managed apology. He sat in further interviews, answered the questions directly, and maintained the position that confronting the darkness inside a moment of grief was more honest than pretending the darkness had never existed. Whether audiences ultimately accepted that framing varied widely. But those who knew him, those who had watched the full arc of his life and work, recognized the admission as consistent with everything Liam Neeson had always been. A man constitutionally incapable of performing a version of himself more comfortable than the truth. By the end of the decade, he was in his late 60s, still working with remarkable consistency, still carrying the physical authority that had made him improbable as an action star and remained impossible to explain away as mere luck. But the fire behind the eyes had changed quality. It was no longer the hunger of a young man from Ballymena pressing his face against the glass of an industry that hadn't decided whether to let him in. It was something steadier, something earned. The grief had not left, but it had, over years and work, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days, found its place inside him. Not as an open wound, but as the thing that made everything else serious. In 2025, Liam Neeson is 72 years old. He still works. Not frantically, not with the hunger of a man chasing something just beyond reach, but with the steady commitment of someone who has long understood that the alternative to purpose is a silence he is not yet ready to inhabit. He rises early, moves carefully through mornings that his body negotiates with more deliberation than it once required, and shows up. On set, on stage, in the rare interviews he grants, with the same quality that directors recognized in Belfast 5 decades ago. Presence, the unmanufactured kind. His face carries every year honestly. The jaw that once defined a particular cinematic severity has softened at its edges. The hair is fully silver now, worn without apology. The frame, still large, still commanding, moves with a deliberateness that speaks not of diminishment, but of awareness. He knows, better than most, what the body costs when you stop paying attention to it. He has not forgotten the ski slope. He has not forgotten what a moment of ordinary inattention can permanently erase. Professionally, the action era has not so much ended as quieted. He accepts fewer films now, and the ones he accepts tend to carry more weight than spectacle. Character studies, smaller productions, projects where the script offers something beyond choreography. He has spoken of wanting, in this chapter, to return more fully to the kind of work that first made him. Theater, intimate drama, the slow burn of performance that requires an audience to lean forward rather than hold on. Whether that return fully materializes remains open. But the intention itself is telling. At 72, Liam Neeson is still moving toward something, not away from it. His sons remain the center of everything. Michael, now in his late 20s, has built a genuine acting career of his own, inheriting not just the family name, but something of the family instinct, that quality of stillness under pressure that makes a camera trust a face. Neeson watches his son's work with an attention that goes beyond parental pride into something more complex. Gratitude, perhaps, that Natasha's particular quality of presence did not disappear from the world when she did, but found its way into the boy she raised. Daniel has built his life away from the industry's light, and Neeson has honored that choice with the same fierce respect he has brought to everything fatherhood has demanded of him. And he speaks of Natasha still, not with the raw edges of early grief, but with the settled sorrow of a man who has accepted that some losses do not resolve. They simply become part of the landscape you live inside. She is present in the way he talks about his sons, in the care he takes with words about love and time, and the danger of assuming tomorrow is guaranteed. She is present in the work he chooses, the moral weight he still demands of every role, the refusal to coast, the insistence that if a performance cannot be true, then it should not be given at all. Those who knew Natasha say she would have found the action films hilarious, not dismissively, but with the specific delight of a woman who understood her husband's capacity for self-seriousness and loved him enough to puncture it gently. They say she would have been immeasurably proud of the boys. They say Liam knows both of these things, and that both of them comfort and devastate him in equal measure, sometimes in the same breath. His philanthropy has deepened quietly with age. He supports organizations working in conflict resolution in Northern Ireland, a commitment that connects directly to the boy who grew up navigating invisible borders in Ballymena. He funds arts education initiatives in Ireland and in underserved communities in New York. The conviction being that what Mr. McCloskey's drama class did for a restless Catholic boy in a Protestant town can be replicated deliberately if the resources exist. He does not attach his name to these efforts loudly. He attaches his money and his time, which has always been a more accurate measure of belief. He and what remains, when you strip away the decades of films and the critical architecture and the biographical drama of a life that contains more genuine tragedy than most screenwriters would dare invent, is something surprisingly simple. A boy who grew up feeling like he existed on the wrong side of every line he could see. religious, social, economic, professional, chose again and again to show up, to stay, to do the work even when the work offered no guarantee, to love without holding anything in reserve, which meant that when love was taken, the loss was total, to speak truthfully even when the truth cost him comfort, to grieve openly in a world that rewards the performance of strength and punishes the admission of fragility. He has not lived a perfect life. He has made choices he would revise, and he has carried anger into places it did not belong and paid the public price for that honesty. He has stumbled, publicly and privately, in the way that all people do when their interior lives are too large to be fully contained by the exterior they present to the world. But he has endured, with dignity, with humor, with the stubborn and undecorated commitment to being present for the people who need him most. Liam Neeson did not become a legend because the world handed him a stage and a spotlight and told him he was destined for them. He became one because he kept showing up to stages that offered no such promise, in a town that had given him no particular reason for hope, with a talent nobody had yet told him was extraordinary. And he kept going until the world had no choice but to look. That is not a Hollywood story. That is a human one, and perhaps that is exactly why it still matters.